Gordon McMullan, Director of the London Shakespeare Centre here. Welcome to King's and welcome to what you will, the King's Shakespeare Festival. James Shapiro, whose job is to pour water for me, is the person we welcome this evening. He's Larry Miller Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, where he's taught since 1985. Born and raised in Brooklyn, he studied at Columbia and at the University of Chicago. He serves on the Board of Governors of the Folger Shakespeare Library and on the Board of Directors of the Royal Shakespeare Company. In 2011, he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His books include, and I have to take a deep breath for this, Rival Playwrights, Marlowe, Jonson, Shakespeare, Shakespeare and the Jews, Ober Ammergau, The Troubling Story of the World's Most Famous Passion Play, 1599, A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare, Contested Will, Who Wrote Shakespeare, and most recently, of course, 1606, William Shakespeare, The Year of Lear, which has been listed as one of the best books of the year by the Wall Street Journal, the Daily Telegraph, the TLS, the Guardian, the Sunday Times, and stacks more. Column Turbine in The Observer notes that 1606 is a meticulous narrative of a momentous year in the life of the playwright and a masterpiece of intelligent literary criticism. According to the Sunday Times reviewer, Shapiro's rich portrait of 1606 is every bit as compelling as his excellent 1599, handling huge amounts of research with a winningly light touch. Am I embarrassing you yet? No, you love it.
No, I told Gordon before I agreed to do this.
I'm not having it.
Don't be nice. And he said, I promise I won't be.
Yeah, but I've got questions to ask yet, so it's okay. And in TLS, Paul Muldoon said, my book of the year is a book of a year in a slightly different sense. James Shapiro's truly magnificent 1606. This is one of those rare academic studies, he says, that reads like a novel with at least one major revelation per page. It's a work of genius. So this evening, Jim will speak about his experience as a critic and as a biographer of Shakespeare. So please welcome him. So what we're going to do is we're going to start, as it were, in conversation. So I'll ask a few questions, after which we will open the floor to you to ask all the questions that I didn't think to ask. All right, I will start. Ostensibly, 1606 is part 2 of 1599, but you must have learned things during the writing of the first book that changed your perspective on the single-year study prior to writing the second book. Are you glad or sorry that you had a second go on the same template, as it were?
I was embarrassed when I finished 1599 that I was one of the cohort that spoke of Shakespeare almost exclusively as an Elizabethan. And part of that was just my professional life. David Castan, who's sitting here in the third row, came to Columbia a year after I did, was a much better lecturer, and immediately commanded the Jacobean Shakespeare course, which he and Gene Howard continued to teach for the first 25 years after I got to Columbia. So by default, they didn't want to teach Titus and Comedy of Errors. I got to do the Titus to Hamlet course. And over time, I really just thought of Shakespeare as an Elizabethan. David went on to Yale, and I immediately turned to the Jacobean Shakespeare and realized that I didn't know the Jacobean Shakespeare very well. And I think of the Year of Lear as an act of reparation in a way, or really trying to come to terms with a Shakespeare that I wasn't familiar with. And I should say at the outset that I had a lot of guides to the Jacobean Shakespeare, not least of all Gordon, who's written quite brilliantly and edited quite brilliantly later Shakespeare, and that helped me. And the BBC had invited me to do a documentary, a 3-part documentary on Shakespeare the King's Man, and I used that as an opportunity to really immerse myself. So in certain ways, it looks like the books are bookended, but when I wrote 1599, I had no idea that I'd ever touch on another year. That one took me 15 years to research and write, and I thought I'd be too old to do another. Luckily, the internet speeds up the process. The internet wasn't really available. There was no EBO when I did 1599, but it actually shaved 5 years off the length of time it took me to research and write that book. And I still, in truth, am much more comfortable with the early Shakespeare than I am with the later Shakespeare. And for that reason, 1606 was a harder book for me to write.
Why do people want an Elizabethan Shakespeare and slightly resent a Jacobean one?
I have a couple of answers to that, and maybe those in the audience will question or challenge that. At least in this country, you love the Tudors. Anything that has to do with the Tudors, the Wolf Hall phenomenon, the TV show The Tudors, you love them. And for reasons that I don't fully understand, you don't like the Stuarts. And Charles I may make a cameo when he appears on a scaffold, but King James, you just go into any bookstore in London and ask for a biography of King James. You will struggle to find one. Look at a cradle-to-grave biography of Shakespeare, and by the time you get to the Jacobean Shakespeare, there are only 50 pages to go in a 700-page book. It's just the reality, and as somebody who cribs a lot from those works and biographies, it was a problem for me. So in a way, Queen Elizabeth and Shakespeare are a perfect match. They're the two iconic figures. But nothing seems to go with King James, certainly not Shakespeare. And that romance, if you will, has never really caught on. So it was a struggle to actually figure out what James was like, since there are two radically different visions of James going back to the 17th century. One is that he's the wisest fool in Christendom, and the other is that he is a best-selling, brilliant king, King of Scotland, who managed pretty well there, and because his son lost his crown and head, was unfairly trashed. So it was hard to make sure I got the cultural and political history right. And as you know, having written about the late Shakespeare, it's hard to fight the 19th century paradigm of the hills and valleys of Shakespeare's career as he slides into the sunset of the romances as if he knew he was going to die or he knew that the glow was going to burn down. So there are a lot of, if you will, teleologies that you struggle with when you come to the Jacobean Shakespeare that are not obstacles with the Elizabethan Shakespeare.
Which do you think made more difference to Shakespeare, the building of the globe in 1599 or becoming a king's man in 1603?
You know, one of the things I've been thinking about of late is Blackfriars. And if you had put that into the equation as well, it would be harder to answer. I think the globe was transformative for Shakespeare, in part because he was part owner of that, and that relieved certain pressures and increased certain pressures on him. And that was his playhouse. But in a way, Blackfriars almost had been his playhouse before the Globe came into the picture. And towards the end of his Jacobean years, after 1606, Blackfriars would play an enormous role again. I don't think becoming a king's man or king's player in 1603 transformed Shakespeare's career. I think it forced him to confront a very different set of challenges. Shakespeare was really lucky that he became a playwright. You know, when he's born, there are no permanent public theaters in London, and by the time he's a teenager, there are. By the time he comes to London and starts writing plays, it's quite clear Queen Elizabeth will never marry, that she has made sure no one will discuss succession. And insofar as the Elizabethan theater was a place where people went to explore the political and emotional, psychological, sexual contradictions of the day and challenges, one of them was who was going to succeed Elizabeth. And from the beginning of his career, Henry VI, Part 1, 2, 3, Richard III, Titus up through Hamlet, he writes succession play after succession play. The king is dead, long live the king. King James comes down from Edinburgh in 1603 with a wife, 2 sons, and a daughter in tow, and you can throw out the succession play as something you could continue writing. It was off the table. So we had to start writing about Britishness rather than Englishness, and that is easier said than done. So I think the advantages of the protection of King James as a royal patron were positive. I think the pressure of playing at court 10 times a year was on the whole positive, but I think having to figure out at the age of 40 or so, how do I understand what people care about now is a real challenge, and I think we see that in the early 17th century. Shakespeareans like to imagine or tell their lecture classes that he wrote 2 plays a year. He did write, on the average, 2 plays a year. But it's very rare that he wrote 2 plays in any given year. And one of the things that I've discovered or gravitated towards is when Shakespeare wrote plays in inspired bunches, including 16, 10, 11, 12, when he's writing Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest. And I think it's more interesting to look at those inspired bunches and then to look at periods where he is not productive, like the early years, relatively speaking. I mean, if you had just written Timon of Athens or Twelfth Night, you'd give yourself a pat on the back. But you know, between Hamlet and King Lear, he's averaging really a play a year, which is not his Elizabethan rate of productivity.
One of the things I've never been able to work out, it seems to me that if you're writing about Elizabeth, you say one thing, if you're writing about James, you say another, and I still couldn't work out what your view of it was. Elizabeth, all the images we have of Elizabeth going to the theatre and so forth in Shakespeare in Love are obviously nonsense. Wonderful, entertaining nonsense, but nonsense all the same. And the basic premise is that James seems to have liked the theatre more than Elizabeth. But on the other hand, he got bored very fast. Did he like theatre more than Elizabeth?
We know when he went up to Oxford in 1605 and was forced to see 3 plays, he fell asleep at the first, he tried to walk out of the second, and refused to see the third. Now, that probably says something more about academic drama, perhaps, or Oxford, perhaps, than it does about James. On the other hand, there's that great document in the exhibition here, which is the Revels accounts of 1604, 1605. And it's a gorgeous document from Kew, and you all get a chance to see it. And on that page, it says that at court, the King's Men, King's Players, Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice, is staged, and then staged again. I think you'll have to turn over the page to see the second performance of The Merchant of Venice. And I always think about that. Did he love The Merchant of Venice, all this justice, mercy stuff? Or did he fall asleep at the first one and just ask them to do it again? And there's no asterisk by Tilney to tell us what the answer is. You get to make that decision yourself, but it's the question that you can't answer, or you can answer, but then it becomes fiction.
Well done for mentioning the exhibition, thank you. The check will be along shortly.
It's a beautiful exhibition, and I have to say I've seen a number of those documents. Some I haven't seen. Seeing them together is always exhilarating. And then you see things that you thought you knew or you didn't know. I was just telling Gordon as we were coming up here that when Shakespeare became a king's man, he was issued 4.5 yards of red cloth for livery to be worn just like this, to make a uniform like a doorman in New York, I suppose, to show up as a royal functionary for processions or maybe meeting the Spanish embassy or a Danish embassy. And what we were talking about as we walked up here is, of the 9 members of his company who are issued these 4.5 yards of red cloth, Shakespeare is listed first. And it just makes you think, I didn't know that, or I'd forgotten it. And what does that tell you about his status at that moment? Or was he well known to the man handing out the cloth? But those are the small things that we as Shakespeare scholars either have to tease meaning out of or let slide by.
So now that we've warmed you up, I have a almost essay-length question, so brace yourself. I'm curious about the deployment of evidence in a book like this, which is designed for a wider public than simply that of academic Shakespeareans. Now, the exhibition across the way contains some of the fairly dry documents that tell us about things Shakespeare did, people he knew, occasions he attended. Critics have for centuries tried to add to that by extrapolating from the plays, trying to build a writer's life on the shaky foundations that are the products of his imagination. So any biographer has to tread a path between the documentary life and the fictional life. As you note in your plague chapter, quote, surely what he was feeling must have deeply informed what he wrote. The problem is that we have no idea what he was feeling at any point during the quarter century that he was writing, other than by, in circular fashion, extrapolating this from his works. So I'm curious to know what decisions you made about this. On page 3, to take a tiny instance, you say of Hymenae that, quote, we can tell from the impact this masque had on his subsequent work that Shakespeare had secured for himself a place in the room that January evening. Now, what are the parameters for we can tell? How do you balance the probabilities and the moments where you do project Shakespeare's thoughts? And how differently do you define evidence for a book designed for a wider readership than the academic than you would for a solely academic book?
I feel like Rumsfeld here, that American sleazy military figure, defense secretary, who talked about known knowns and known unknowns. And this may sound a little bit like that. At a certain point, you have to decide what is inadmissible and what you do not believe. So, for example, if you opened up most cradle-to-grave biographies of Shakespeare, some of whom are written by people I've broken bread with and shared alcohol with and know and admire, when you turn to 1606, their chapters are almost entirely filled with a discussion of Shakespeare's sexual escapades with an innkeeper's wife in Oxford, simply because William Davenant, good second-rate dramatist of the mid-17th century, probably 2 or 3 of you are doing dissertations on him. I don't want to malign him here, but in his cups he would brag about how Shakespeare did his mom, in the hope of people thinking that a bit of Shakespeare's DNA, although he wouldn't have called it that, had rubbed off on him. Well, that's great if you're writing about Davenant and what he's bragging about. But then those scholars go back and say, well, he was born in 1606, so let's place Shakespeare in his mom's lap in that year, and then go to great lengths describing what that relationship illicit must have been like. My grandmother would have called that Baba Maisa, and those kinds of, and that's a Yiddish expression, and that kind of story, it seems to me, doesn't pass the smell test or the let's fictionalize it to reach a larger audience. I'm not interested actually in fictionalizing Shakespeare's life and writing, reaching a larger audience. I'm interested in writing in a style, because I don't know more than other Shakespeareans. I just pay more attention to writing in a way that a large number of readers would feel is more appealing. Let's go back to Johnson's Masque. I've read Johnson's Masque more times than I would like to recall. Masques, as Jonathan's brilliant talk showed, are off the curve, and just in all kinds of ways, including readability, because a masque script cannot capture song, dance, costume, staging, large globes opening up and 12 aristocrats exiting. Gorgeous young women at court wearing pearls that have been pawned from every jeweler in London. A script cannot capture that. What that masque, which was published by Johnson in 1606 in a quarto, contains is, in a sense, Shakespeare's repost in The Tempest, where so many of the visual details of that masque are present. Juno, the peacocks, the splendor. So when you experience that mask in The Tempest, when I experience it, and I've worked with theater companies at the Public Theater who have to stage that, one of the things I ask myself is, was it possible for Shakespeare to have simply picked up that quarto of Johnson's text and perhaps spoken to one or two people who were at court among the 600 or so people who attended that masque in early January 1606, and had enough information to have responded to it as he does in The Tempest? And the answer is no. And I would argue that till the cows come home. And on the basis of that, I then say on page 3, Shakespeare was there in the audience. And that's why I feel I can make that kind of claim. And I have to say, every one of those claims cost me a couple of nights' sleep. Do I make this? Do I not? Do I step over this line? Do I not? And the truth is, I don't know whether I got it right or not. In 30 years, people may be mocking 1599 and 1606 in the way that they mock early 20th century biographies of Shakespeare. And I live in dread of that mockery. And for that reason, tried as best I could to stay on this side of the line. But there's very little that we know about Shakespeare. And there's a lot that has been written about that very little. And in the end, you trust the critics, several of whom I'm looking out and mentally thanking as I speak, and you trust your training, and you trust your principles and your judgment. And I hope I don't live to see the day when the book is mocked justifiably, but I feel an obligation, because I'm not only writing to 200 other scholars or 1,000 other scholars, but to a larger community of people who trust me to accurately portray what I'm given the fellowship, time, and privilege to research, and they in their daily lives are not. So I feel the weight of that as well, and my obligations to those readers.
One of the things your book makes clear is that Shakespeare, entirely contrary to the romantic conception of him sitting alone in an attic, receiving inspiration from heaven, as it were, was one among many playwrights, fellow actors, and so forth. And at the same time, you do establish certain differences between Shakespeare and the rest of them, differences that weren't visible in Jonathan's graphs just now. What's the balance? How much was he embedded in his industry, and how much was he in some way detached or detachable?
That is another great question, and one that brings in another real problem, which is how not to read Shakespeare from a 21st century perspective of our sense of, say, collaboration. Collaboration is an interesting way into that. When I went to school, although I never took a Shakespeare course, when I read about Shakespeare, what I read was that he was a solo author. And when I began my career teaching Titus Andronicus, nobody ever told me that that play was collaborative. And when I got to Pericles, he was known but suppressed. And the same holds true for other collaborative works. And the revolution, one of the revolutions in Shakespeare studies in the last 2 decades, has been acknowledging the extent, both at the beginning and at the end of his career, that Shakespeare collaborated. What's less often discussed is Shakespeare's also collaborating smack dab in the middle of his career in a play like Timon of Athens. And what does it mean to do that? What does it mean to collaborate on Pericles when seemingly you are at the top of your game? Why are you reaching out to George Wilkins, who's, a woman beater and an innkeeper and not a very prolific, we only have one other play from him. Middleton, I can understand. Fletcher, you can understand better. You've written about it eloquently. So if I'm trying to think about how Shakespeare is both like and unlike others, I would say he is like others insofar as he collaborates. I would say he is unlike others insofar as, and again, I'm projecting slightly here, in the Jacobean period, he didn't need to collaborate with others, but he reached out to younger, talented playwrights, Fletcher, who succeeded him as the principal writer for his company, Middleton, who understood city comedy in a way that the Warwickshire-born Shakespeare never did and never would. And he, I'm not saying vampire-like, sucked the blood life out of these younger writers, but I think he had enough confidence in his game to feel comfortable and not threatened, teaming up with writers who are 15 years younger and saying, let's put a play together. And that tells me something about Shakespeare as a Jacobean writer that I didn't know growing up, and that shapes the way I think of him in 1606. Even though he's not collaborating in 1606, it shapes the way I think of Shakespeare as a writer in that year.
For me, one of the most powerful moments of the book comes in chapter 8, when you note the extent of the engagement of the Tempest with the Hamas, time and night, which obviously requires you to cheat a bit and move forward to 1611. There's a kind of, I don't know how to put it exactly, the synchronic analysis, the single year analysis, actually requires a certain amount of compression that makes me wonder what 1599, 1606, your books do to the standard way of reading Shakespeare's career as a linear movement from one more or less personal or generic phase to another. And, you know, which would normally read the late plays, would normally read The Tempest as a totally different phase of Shakespeare's career from King Lear, from Macbeth. And yet, the effect of writing the way you've written, in a way, squishes them together. And is that something that was conscious, or something that you found happening as you were working on it?
That's desperation. Honestly, 1599 came easily to me. There's a lot more evidence from that year. I've been teaching those plays for most of my professional life. 1606 is a year in which Shakespeare largely disappears from the print record, from the performance record, and frankly, it was much heavier lifting to tease out storylines. And I'll give you an example of one that was a huge relief to me. We all know that Shakespeare used the life of Antony when he wrote Antony and Cleopatra. And when we look at it as Shakespeareans, we tend to go immediately to the barge she sat in, that wonderful passage from North's translation of Plutarch's Lives, and hold it up and show it to our students and insist that Shakespeare really wasn't a plagiarist because you could do this back then. And that's really the extent to which we're looking at the life of Antony. And I had to go back and think about, well, what was Shakespeare's relationship to this particular life in a series of lives in a book that he knew intimately? And one of the things you discover is, well, when he's writing Macbeth, he's using bits of the life of Antony that he decides to leap over in Antony and Cleopatra. And when he's writing Timon of Athens, a little bit before this, he ends Timon of Athens with material that he lifts out of the life of Antony. Now, if you look at or edit Timon of Athens or Antony or Macbeth, you never look at these in relationship to each other. But if you're desperately struggling to come up with storylines for a book about 1606, you suddenly realize, God, he's been thinking about this, and maybe even obsessed slightly about it. And were I a more biographical critic, I would have started to think more, and I did, and I stopped myself because I don't want to be that kind of critic. Thinking, well, maybe in certain ways Shakespeare identifies with this aging Roman general. But I stopped short of that and simply wrote about the ways I invite anybody who's trying to write a novel about Shakespeare in his Jacobean years to run with that. But there are ways in which simply slicing up what's been done in a broad sweep allows you to see things that are just there. I didn't discover this. It's there. And yet the way we teach, edit, and write about Shakespeare tends to prevent us from seeing what is transparent.
Do you not think of yourself as a biographer then, exactly?
I don't really think of myself as a biographer. My wonderful editor, Julian Luce, is here. He's never used that to describe me or my work. It's not to say that one day I wouldn't want to write biography. I read a lot of biography, but I think of myself as a cultural historian. And if the book required labeling, like food labels or clothing labels that say, 38% wool, 22% cotton, I would say that this book, and maybe you would give the different numbers, but I'd say it's 65% history, 35% Shakespeare, and being sold as the opposite to that. Do you think that's an accurate, or would you give the numbers as 70-30? I mean, I'm just curious.
We'll ask the editor.
He'll never say.
I have just to shift gear, I have a local question. How important to Shakespeare was this immediate area, the Strand, Somerset House, Little Rome, or what's now Drury Lane? We're right in the middle of it, aren't we? Right here.
Anybody who knows the life of Queen Anne and knows that this year, James's queen, she moved into Somerset House and, in a sense, stopped giving birth to children shortly after this year. So this turned out to be her place. In late 1605, there was, in August of that year, a Danish embassy that came from James's brother-in-law. One of the stories that figures largely towards the end of my book is the brother-in-law's visit from hell, in which King Christian came, brother of Queen Anne, sailed from Scandinavia, arrived in London, and planned for an extended visit here. And every playwright, every designer, every poet was planning from March on to make a little money from flattering the two kings. And everybody wrote about it. Well, as soon as Christian came here, he started drinking heavily, which he always did. He could knock back, they said, 30 drinks a night and still stagger back to his chambers. He kept a little diary with X's, whether he was, shit-faced drunk or worse than shit-faced drunk, and he recorded that every night. James would have, as one of his biographers said, a little thimble full of wine. So Christian was drinking, and James was riding horses to death in a way that offended Christian, and he was mistreating Christian's wife, who had just lost a child. And these two kings did not get along, and Christian packed up his ships and sailed home weeks early. And Shakespeare's company played before the kings twice. This was central to every dramatist in the land. So I forgot what sent me off in this direction, but remind me of Somerset House, the Strand. This was her base of operations. Somerset House became her place. And frankly, for all the court performances, this was a well-trafficked area when people went back and forth to Whitehall. This was on the path. And when we talk about the performances in 1604, 1605, night after night at Whitehall, that was the same crowd going back night after night. And you would see, if you lived in this area, the richest hundreds of people in the land going to court past your door to see 10 plays by Shakespeare, 2 by Jonson, the Spanish Gypsy, and whatever. So, this was the place to be.
It's funny watching the faces, isn't it? The recognition for brother-in-law visit from hell or 30 drinks a night. I have a different local question. Where I come from, Liverpool, one question matters more than any other. Liverpool or Everton? The clue, of course, is in the order. Mets, Yankees for you, I assume, is that right?
I'm a Mets fan, that's true.
Okay,
and
good. So I got
proud
the order right?
Yes.
For Shakespeareans, the question is slightly different. Hamlet or Lear?
Ooh, that's a hard question. Reg Folks wrote a wonderful book. Reg Folks is one of the most brilliant and influential scholars who I fear won't be remembered for his contribution to the field, but he was not only a great guy, but he taught me a lot. And I will always be grateful when I sent him $15.99 for his 18-page, single-space, brutal critique of that book, which saved me a great deal of embarrassment. But he wrote a book, really, Hamlet versus Lear, It's kind of King Kong versus Godzilla in Shakespearean terms. And Hamlet had dominated forever. You know, there's a reason why in 1605, I think, or 4, the first critic of Hamlet said, "It pleaseth all." It did forever, until the Cold War, until that post-Holocaust apocalyptic moment when Lear criticism and productions finally overtook Hamlet. And then they didn't. The market and Lear relatively crashed, and Hamlet, with the Eastern Europe and the rise of the selfie, I don't know what accounts for Hamlet's continued popularity, but Hamlet still kills. I have to say, and I'm not trying to evade that question, I think Hamlet is a better crafted play, and for me, Lear is a more powerful play, but a structurally unsound play. And I don't really write about that much, but I think about these. I get more pleasure from productions of Hamlet. I feel more pain at productions of Lear. So I suppose it's what I'm into at the moment that I'm going to the theater.
You sound suspiciously like an Everton fan to me, I have to say. Very worrying. My recollection of Reg Folks actually is not entirely dissimilar. When I started editing Henry VIII for the Arden, Reg had done Henry VIII in the 1950s. And I went to the Huntington Library and rather nervous of approaching the great man who'd done this before. And he suggested we go for a hike up one of those really surprisingly steep hills near Huntington. And, you know, he was about 40 years older than me, and he went stomping off. And after a while, I was sweating and I couldn't breathe. And the exact point at which I couldn't possibly get words out, he started interrogating me. My final question before I open up. The cliche is that people who write books about the lives of other people are really writing about themselves. You say, in 1606, Shakespeare wasn't ready to retire or rest on his past achievements. He still had more to say and hadn't yet tired of the grueling writing regimen that had defined his life since his mid-20s. Is this Shakespeare? Or is this James Shapiro wearing one of those Shakespeare masks?
That is a wonderful question. And the answer to that question is always 5 years after the book is published. I wrote, and maybe this will come as consolation for those of you struggling with your dissertation. Gordon didn't mention my dissertation, nor did he say my dissertation became my first book. That's because I wrote an utterly unpublishable piece of dreck about, and maybe Jonathan may be the only person who's even heard of this, because it was a linguistic analysis of Marlowe's metrical style. It's not interesting.
I mean, it's interesting that you've suppressed it so well.
I've not suppressed it, and had I entered the market now with that dissertation, I would be one of the better baristas in Brooklyn as we speak, because it's a different marketplace. And I have to thank David Castan, who offered me a one-year job at Dartmouth and held his nose when he held up this dissertation. And that was a while back, and I'm still grateful. But my answer to that is, 5 years after that, I said, what was I thinking? And what I was thinking was, what I really wanted to write about was Shakespeare and the Jews. And my mentors at Chicago, University of Chicago, said, there are no Jews in Elizabethan England, there are no Jewish questions, find another topic. And I couldn't deal with the topic that mattered to me, so I found one that completely didn't matter to me, that I could write in 9 months and get off of my father's paycheck and go into the world and start working. Each book has to have an autobiographical dimension. I wrote Shakespeare and the Jews in part because I married a Roman Catholic. I wrote Ober Ammergau a number of years after because we had a child and I wanted to understand something about Jewish-Christian conflict. I also wanted to know why a Bavarian play from 1634 was Hitler's favorite play since it vilified the Jews. There's always a balance between what you're curious about in terms of cultural history and what you are working out. I can't tell you what I'm working out. I mean, yeah, that line's in there, and Julian Luce wrote it, and I kept it in there. But that's not what's truly autobiographical. Bring me back in 5 years, and I will have a clearer sense as the smoke clears about what is truly autobiographical, because you cannot write the book thinking you're writing yourself. And if you do, nobody will read or buy that book. But there is something in this book. I don't know what it is yet, and I'm looking forward to figuring that out.
Right, enough questions from me. Over to you. Anything you like for Jim?
Fire away. Gordon said he was going to be tough. I hope you will be tougher than he is. And if you just want to stand and ask the question, I'll repeat it, and in a form that I could actually answer. Is there? Okay. Don't be shy. I will really answer any question you have. I'm not sure if I'll answer it honestly, but I will answer it. There's a question right here.
I hope this is a question. How important do you think those people that Shakespeare collaborated with were to Shakespeare himself? Particularly John Fletcher, if he then succeeded him. I didn't know that.
The Fletcher, I'm embarrassed answering any questions about Fletcher with Gordon up here. I mean, he's written extensively, and what I have to say would only parrot that. The best answer I can give is how important to us is a relationship with any colleague. Some colleagues, like Lodge, we might learn from early on in our career. Some of these relationships, like the one with Middleton, may be much more intimate and extensive. If you look at, and Jowett has done brilliant work on the collaboration between Shakespeare and Middleton in Timon of Athens. If you look at the nature of that collaboration, very closely in certain scenes, you'll see that it's a back and forth. It's not Brian Vickers' sterile imagining, you write Act 1, I write Act 2, that we divide this up and then we combine them as if it's an academic festschrift of one kind or another. That's how academics tend to think about collaboration. That's not how Simon and Garfunkel thought about collaboration. And that's not how Shakespeare and Middleton collaborated. And all of a sudden, collaboration, if you're looking closely at that scene and you have all kinds of colored markers for the different stylistic traits of each writer, you start thinking, well, this is Shakespeare and this is Middleton, and all of a sudden, is this Shakespeare trying to sound like Middleton, or Middleton trying to sound like Shakespeare? Because once you get two people working closely in a room, and there's coffee, well, there wasn't coffee back then, when there's alcohol or anything else that's lubricating that conversation, collaboration gets really interesting. So I can't speak to Fletcher, but I've taught Middleton in graduate seminars enough to know that that was an intimate, intellectual, creative exchange between two people 15, 16 years apart that were bringing their best game.
Next question. Don't be shy, there must be more. I must have asked all the wrong questions. There's one.
Hello. I was just wondering, if at any point in your career did you believe all those people who were like, no, Shakespeare isn't really Shakespeare, he's actually Edward de Vere, or any of these other ridiculous things that can't really be true? Did you ever subscribe to those kind of ideas or think about that stuff?
You mean that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare?
Yeah, because you know that horrible film Anonymous that came out that has the plays coming out at the wrong time in the wrong years, and then says it's the truth about who Shakespeare really is. That kind of stuff.
I never for a moment, simply because I've handled the kind of documents that are in the building next to us, doubted that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. But I became fascinated, and anybody who's ever sat through a departmental meeting will share to a certain extent this fascination, why smart people think and say dumb things. And I think Henry James is very smart. I think Mark Twain is pretty smart. I think Helen Keller was very smart. And the list goes on. Sigmund Freud, he had a gift. And all of these creative, talented people all believed at one point or another in their careers that Shakespeare was not the author of the plays attributed to him. I wasn't interested. Why they thought so turned out to be a lot less interesting than what brought them to that point. And I became interested, and I wrote a book, Contested Will, in part about this, in why they thought what they did. But never for a moment did I believe that. I finally had an opportunity, or not finally, but fortunately had an opportunity to speak with Roland Emmerich, who was the billion-dollar filmmaker of Anonymous. And the opportunity came at the New Yorker Film Festival, where he was plugging his film, and one of the conditions of showing the film was he had to get up in a situation quite like this and answer questions. And I have to say Roland Emmerich is not somebody I would rank with Freud, Mark Twain, or Henry James. And I had the pleasure of asking him the kind of questions that we ordinarily think of when we leave the theater after watching a movie like that. My question for him was, why are all the bad guys in this film Semitic and bloodthirsty, and all the good guys blonde and obsessed with race? At which point he started getting out of his chair. And he's a German filmmaker with a family with a complicated past during the Third Reich. But there are all kinds of biographical and autobiographical things that people put into their work that they are unaware of when they create their work. And that was, I suppose, the same autobiographical question that I was asking of myself, of him in making that film. But the short and long answer is the people who don't believe Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, that the Earl of Oxford wrote, or Marlowe or Bacon, for them it's a matter of faith. And cultural history and faith really don't have a lot of overlap. You have to weigh evidence. If you're a cultural historian, you have to have doubt. And they have no doubt. So people who have no doubt are, to my mind, less interesting than those who do doubt, or are rigorously skeptical, have to withstand questions publicly and privately from people like Gordon.
We have another 7 or so minutes. At least 2 more questions.
Please, stand and I'll repeat your question.
I can project.
Good. I can tell.
So we talked a little bit about authorial collaboration, and in the book you actually, in a couple of places, talk about possible relationships between the other actors in the company, Burbage and Armin. And I was curious if you had any insight or even just theories about what collaboration, not necessarily between the writers, but between the members of the company would have been like.
That's a really great question. And if there were any body of information that I would like to know more about, if you ask me, would I rather know with whom Shakespeare slept, or how he sat down and decided which members of the company would get which roles, or how the company decided that, whatever, say, Shakespeare may or may not have had by 1606, I'd much rather know about that. And I've done my best in both 1599 and 1606 to tease out to the extent that we can. I mean, there are people who write books saying, this person had this role, this person had that role. It goes back to Baldwin, who had great confidence in that. I don't have great confidence in that. I know that Armin played the fool in Lear, and I know that Burbage played leading roles, and Lear was one of them. And the best I could do was try to imagine, what did it mean for Shakespeare to mingle kings and clowns in this play in a way that he tends not to in others? But we don't know, especially for the Jacobean Shakespeare, enough about who played what role. And I think were we more informed about that, we would have a much richer sense of what these plays were like in performance. And because I spend more and more of my time in rehearsal rooms, I now am the Shakespeare Scholar in residence at the Public Theater, and we put on 5 productions of Shakespeare a year, and I have to be there for weeks of rehearsal. I'm beginning to understand how different these plays work and matter to actors and directors than they do to scholars. And I suppose had I started 1606 later or started working more closely with playing companies, that would have shaped my book even more. Michael Boyd brought me in 6 or 7 years ago to start working with the RSC, and I'm aware on every page of this book where what I learned in rehearsal informed my understanding, critical understanding of the plays. So if I knew anything more about Shakespeare's company and how these actors got along, the only truism I know is I think alone among the various companies, no one in Shakespeare's company killed another player from that company. And if you're rehearsing every morning and taking a break for a meal and then performing in the afternoon and maybe going to the Tavern Inn for 1 or 2 after, tempers rise, they flare. But if you look down at that exhibition, again, and look at that will, and the money Shakespeare left for rings for his fellow players, you sense that this was a collaboration that rarely, if ever, boiled over. And that, too, is something that is extraordinary and inadequately acknowledged by those of us who talk about these plays.
Final question, please.
Dr. Shapiro, I just want to ask you on it.
A little bit louder.
It's a bit specific, but I just wanted to find out to what extent, if at all, how far do you subscribe to the view that the character of Prospero in The Tempest is actually Shakespeare himself, and also whether or not, and he's actually saying, at the end he's actually saying farewell
To the stage. Did you all hear that question? You know, the question is, to what extent do I see Prospero as an autobiographical character and Shakespeare is saying farewell to the stage? As a great fan of Gordon's work on the late plays, the first thing I would say is Shakespeare went on to write Two Noble Kinsmen, Cardenio, and Henry VIII. So if that were a farewell to the stage, it was not a very honest farewell to the stage. And if the Globe Theatre hadn't burned down at a production of Henry VIII, for all we know, he would have written 2 or 3 or 4 more plays. And he's still freelancing on an impresa with Burbage after this. So I think that's rubbish, or rather a great 19th century story. That even David Bevington and people who should know better still circulate because it is such a good story. Here's the problem with cradle-to-grave biographies of Shakespeare. They're great. You begin with those lost years. They're lost. You get to fill them with sexual escapades, with religious doubt, with travels abroad. With travels abroad that lead to religious doubt and sexual escapade. And then you get to end them. You get to end the life, since we don't know what killed him, either with that wonderful Binnen Germain's Greer's syphilitic Shakespeare's wounds being bathed by his wife, or for those more interested in alcohol, a besotted evening in Stratford or London that leads to his death, or that wonderful Dowden 19th century portrait of Shakespeare paddling off into the sunset in The Tempest. They're great stories. They just happen to be fiction. And if you're writing fiction, that is the way you should end Shakespeare's life.
On that marvellous valedictory note, we have run out of time. It is always a joy listening to Jim talking about his work. Few people seem to be able to articulate with such honesty what they go through when they go through the writing experience over periods of years. And I'm always grateful to hear it. I assume you were too. So will you join me in thanking Jim?